Deputies, let's return our jury, please. May be seated. Thank you. State of Florida may call their next witness.
They would call Erin West.
Is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth to help you God?
I do. Good afternoon. Will you please say your first and last name and spell your last name for the record?
My name is Erin West. Last name is spelled W-E-S-T.
Where are you employed?
I am currently employed for the Osceola County Sheriff's Office.
How long have you been with the Sheriff's Office?
I have been with the Sheriff's Office since 2016.
Prior to being at the Osceola County Sheriff's Office, where were you employed?
Directly prior?
Yes.
Directly prior to the Sheriff's Office, I worked in multiple different locations, but I worked for the Brevard County Sheriff's Office, and I've also worked as a government contractor for the United States Army, as well as the FBI.
What are your duties at the Osceola County Sheriff's Office?
Currently, I am employed as the crime scene manager at the Osceola County Sheriff's Office. So I am responsible for overseeing our forensic services, which includes our forensic unit, our latent print unit, and our evidence unit.
In January of 2020, what was your assignment?
In January of 2020, I would have been employed in the latent print unit within the Osceola County Sheriff's Office.
What were you doing while you were a member of the latent print unit?
As a member of the latent print unit, I was responsible for analyzing and comparing latent print impressions that were recovered from crime scenes and also from items of evidence in the laboratory. I worked in the latent print unit for several years at the Osceola County Sheriff's Office, first as a latent print examiner, and then I was promoted into the supervisory position over that unit.
Did you work as a latent print analyst anywhere else other than the Osceola County Sheriff's Office?
I have worked as a latent print analyst and worked with latent prints throughout the course of my career since I started in forensics in 2006.
What is the difference between a latent print and a known print?
So a latent print is a chance recording of the friction ridge skin, which the friction ridge skin is the raised portion of the skin that's located on the palms of our hands and the soles of our feet. And when we touch objects, we leave behind an impression of that friction ridge skin. It essentially works just like a stamp does. If you think about a rubber stamp, it has an image on the bottom of it. You put ink on it and you place that onto a surface and it leaves behind an impression of that image. Our friction ridge skin does the same. So we have sweats and oils and other residues on the surface of our friction ridge skin. And when we touch a surface, we leave behind a stamp of our friction ridge skin. So a latent print is that residue that we've left behind of the impression of our friction ridge skin. And we typically use chemical or physical means to develop that so it's visible to the naked eye. A known print is something that we intentionally record from a known individual. So we typically will use something like a black printer's ink. We will roll the ink on the surface of the friction ridge skin and roll that skin across a contrasting background like a white fingerprint card. And that way it records the friction ridge skin of that individual and we know what individual it came from. So we typically will use ink to do that, or we can use a live scan system, which essentially we place their fingers or palms on a scanner and the scanner captures the friction ridge skin images.
When you receive latent prints and known prints to be compared to each other, what is your process for doing that?
So when latent prints are recovered, they are either recovered by our officers or our forensic personnel. They are submitted into our evidence unit as items of evidence. And as a latent print examiner, I would go to our evidence unit and sign out those items of evidence. They would be signed into our unit and then we would start working them. So we would open the evidence packaging. We would examine the contents of the evidence packaging to make sure that what was documented on the exterior of the packaging is actually on the inside. And then we would go through the individual latents that we were provided to see what kind of information we could gather off of them, and if there is enough information present there for us to conduct a comparison. So when I am starting that process, we use a method called ACE-V when we are conducting comparisons. So the first thing that I would do in that process is I would analyze. That is what the A stands for, analyze the latent prints that are contained within the packaging. We are looking for a variety of different information when we are analyzing a latent print. So there are certain levels of details that we're looking for. The first level of detail is pattern types or ridge flow. So we have specific pattern types that the population, all of us in the population have on our fingertips. And then we have specific ridge flow that's present in our palms. So we would evaluate the latent prints to see if we can observe any of that. So for example, in our fingerprints, we have 3 common pattern types: loops, arches, and whorls. Loops, they enter in from one side of the finger, the ridges do, and they curve and they exit out the same side of the finger. Whorls are circular patterns of ridge formations that happen in the center of our fingers, and arches are patterns where the ridges flow in from one side of the finger, they raise slightly, and they exit out the other side of the finger, kind of like a hill. And we all have different combinations of these patterns on our fingers. So that's the first thing we would be looking for, is a specific type of pattern or ridge flow. After we examine the latents for level 1 detail, we would look for level 2 detail, which is the actual individual characteristics that are happening in the ridges, within the ridges. So we have hundreds of ridges in our fingers and in our palms, and there are characteristics that are common to them. So there are 3 types of characteristics that happen in our ridges. The first are called ridge endings. That's when the ridge travels along and it abruptly stops. Second is called bifurcations. That's when the ridge is traveling along and it splits into 2. And the third are called dots, and they're just small segments of ridges that are detached from the ridges around them. So when we're looking for level 2 detail, we're going to determine how much of that is present and their orientation and location to one another. Then we're going to be looking at level 3 detail, which is the individual pores. So we have sweat pores that are located on the palms of our hands and the soles of our feet. That's why our hands get clammy and sweaty sometimes. Those pores, the sweat actually opens out, the pore opens onto the tops of the ridges.
Narrative.
Ask your next question.
What additional information do you look at when you're looking at latent prints in order to be able to utilize them to compare?
Besides the information I was just going through.
Besides the information you already went through, is there additional information that you look for?
Yes, so I told you guys how I look for level 1, 2 details, and then I was describing level 3, which is pores and the shapes of the ridges. And in addition to that, we'll take into account like the surface that it was on, the type of processing that was used when it was developed, the processing technique, and all of those things. So we'll do all of that data collecting. And once we have determined all of that information, then we'll move into the comparison stage. So at that point, I'm going to take all of the information that I gathered in that first step, and I'm going to compare it to the set of known prints. And I'm going to look back and forth between the known and the unknown to determine if all of that information that I just told you guys about is present in the known print as well. So we're going to be looking back and forth between the latent and known and comparing that data. At that point, once I've conducted that comparison, I'm going to reach the evaluation stage, which is essentially where I'm going to come to a conclusion. So I'm going to come to one of 3 conclusions where I can either identify the latent print to the known print and saying that those 2 impressions originated from the same source. I can come to the conclusion of an exclusion, which means that they were not made by the same source. Or I can reach an inconclusive, which means that essentially I need more information. And so that's how we would conduct a comparison within the unit.
Is every latent print that is collected able to be utilized by you?
No, every latent print that's collected I have not personally been able to utilize.
What are some of the issues that you have come across in your career that would prohibit you from analyzing a latent print?
So I would still conduct an analysis on any latent print that I received to determine what information is present. And some of the reasons why we might not use a latent print for comparison is that the quality of the latent print is very poor. Maybe there's a lot of interference from the processing method that was used or the surface that it came off of, and the information's not very clear, so it's not readily usable for us. It might be very, very small, so we might just not have a lot of information there at all. So even if it's clear, maybe it's just very, very tiny and there's not a lot of information to draw from it. So those might be some of the reasons why we might not use a latent print for comparison.
What information do you need in order to be able to make a positive identification?
So to make an identification when we are comparing the latent print to the known print, we would expect that the information that we have located in the latent print is also present in the known. And we will be going back and forth looking for both similarities and dissimilarities between the two prints. And if we reach a point where we have found a lot of discrepancies between the two, then we will exclude those as belonging to the same source. If we are going through and we're finding that the information we're seeing in the latent print is also present in the known, and we have an abundance of that information, so much so that we would not expect to find those similarities in any two other random people, then we would move forward with making that an identification.
During your career, since 2006, roughly how many times have you had the opportunity to compare latent prints to known prints?
At this point in my career, I have compared hundreds of thousands of latent prints to known prints.
Did you receive latent prints in this case as well as a set of known prints?
Yes, I did.
For the record, I'm approaching the witness with what's been marked state 6 and state 29. First, talking about states 29. Did you receive states 29 in order to review as known prints?
Yes, I did.
And who does the packaging purport these prints to be from?
The packaging indicates that these prints belong to Anthony John Todt.
What is in the packaging for the known prints? And when I say that, are both hands imaged in there, all 10 fingers, that type of information?
The packaging indicates that it's major case prints, and so when we are collecting a set of major case prints, that would include the recording of all of the fingers as well as the palms.
And states 6 are latent print cards that you received in this case?
Yes, that's correct.
And the latent print cards, how many did you receive?
I received 14 latent print cards in total.
Did you identify each of the cards utilizing a separate number?
I did mark the individual cards with a unique identifier.
What unique identifier did you use?
We typically begin with the item number. So in this case, this exhibit was assigned as Exhibit 55. So I would have gone through each of the cards and labeled each card starting with the number 1. So I would have started with 55-1, 55-2, and I would have continued through 55-14.
Latent card 55-1. Does the card indicate where this latent print was recovered?
Yes, there are descriptions written on the back of the cards.
What does 55-1 indicate to you?
May I read from the card?
Yes.
The back of 55-1 indicates that it was lifted from a Benadryl box, marker 11, and then in parentheses it says side.
Are there any other print cards related to this specific Benadryl box that you marked?
I believe there were additional ones as well, yes.
Would that be 55-2 and 55-8?
Yes, that is correct.
And did you perform a comparison for 55-1, 55-2, and 55-8 in comparison with the known prints that you received as being from Anthony Todt?
Yes, I did. I did analysis on 51-1, -2, and -8, and I was able to compare latent prints that were located on 55-1 and 55-2. And then 55-8, I didn't observe any latent prints of value for comparison.
What opinion did you form with regards to 55-1?
On 55-1, I observed one latent print of value for comparison. I conducted a comparison on that and compared that latent print to the known prints that were provided of, I'm sorry, is it Todt? Not Todt, Todt. And the latent print I identified to the right middle finger of Todt.
What about 55-2?
So 55-2 was the same. I identified one latent print of value for comparison on this card. I conducted the comparison with the known prints and identified this latent print to the right thumb of Todt.
And you said 55-8 you determined did not have value to you?
Correct.
What does that mean?
So when I evaluated the information that was present on the latent print, either there were no latent prints present or there was not enough information or the information was of too poor quality to conduct a comparison with.
Next, let's talk about 55-3. Did you have other latent cards that correlated with the item of evidence from 55-3?
So the description on the back of 55-3 matched one other card in the case.
What's the other card number?
The other card number was 55-7.
And where do these latent print cards indicate the print is from?
The back of the latent print card on these two lifts indicated that they were collected from a Benadryl box at marker 20, and the 55-3 in parentheses it says side/flap, and 55-7 says in parentheses side.
Were you able to locate any latent prints of value from 55-3?
55-3, I did not see any latent prints that could be utilized for comparison on that lift card.
How about 55-7?
55-7, I did find one latent print of value for comparison. I compared that latent print to the known prints of Todt and identified it to the right thumb of Todt.
Next, let's talk about 55-4. Where does the latent print card indicate that these latent prints are from?
55-4, the description says that it was lifted from a Benadryl. In parentheses, it says 202B, 100 tablet box, and then there's another parentheses that says side.
Are there any other latent print cards that also appear to be from this same piece of evidence?
Yes, there is.
Which numbers are those?
55-5 and 55-6 are indicated as being lifted from the same location.
Did you recover any, were there any utilized latent prints from 55-6?
No, there were not.
Why not?
Same as before, when I evaluated this latent print card, I didn't observe any latent print impressions of value for comparison.
What about 55-4?
55-4, I did have one latent print on this card that I went ahead and conducted a comparison with, and that was one of the ones that I came to the conclusion of inconclusive for. So inconclusive would mean that there was not enough information to definitively say that it was an identification or an exclusion.
What about 55-5?
55-5, there was one latent print of value for comparison on this latent print card, and that I compared with the known prints of Todt, and that was identified to the right thumb of Todt. Oh, my apologies, the right middle finger of Todt.
Let's talk about latent print card 55-9. Were there usable latent prints on this card?
Yes, I did compare one latent print from the card that I labeled 55-9.
Where did the card indicate that the latent prints were from?
The description written on the back of this card says it was lifted from the front of black iPhone from marker number 1.
In either 55-9 or 55-10, were you able to make any identifications?
I was able to identify one latent print on the card that was labeled 55-9, and I identified that to the right palm print of Todt. And then for 55-10, I did not observe any latent prints of value for comparison on that card.
What about 55-14? Where does that latent print card indicate those latents were recovered from?
So the card that's labeled 55-14, the written description indicates that it was lifted from a Benadryl bottle from the kitchen trash can.
Did you observe any usable latent prints from this card?
I did. I observed 4 latent print impressions on this card that were a value for comparison.
What opinion did you form with regards to 55-14?
So the 4 latent prints that I located were individually labeled. 2 of the latent prints, I reached the conclusion of inconclusive, which I explained earlier was there wasn't enough information to make a determination of either identification or exclusion. And then the last two latent prints, one I identified to the right thumb of Todt, and one I identified to the left middle finger of Todt.
You also received latent print cards that you labeled 55-11, 55-12, and 55-13.
Yes.
Where were these print cards labeled that those prints came from?
So the card that I labeled 55-11, that one, the description indicates it was lifted from the side of blade, green/black buck knife. 55-12, the description indicated it was lifted from the side of blade, black and silver buck knife. And 55-13, the description indicates it was lifted from side of blade, black and silver buck knife.
Was there any information in any of those three latent print cards that was able to be utilized by you?
No, I was not able to conduct any comparisons with any latent impressions that were left on these cards.
Was the defendant in any of the latent print cards that you were able to compare excluded from any of the prints that were found?
I did not come to the conclusion of exclusion in any of the latent prints. There were 10 latent prints in total that I compared. 7 I was able to identify to Todt, and the remaining 3 were all listed as inconclusive, which essentially there wasn't enough information to make a determination either way.
And when you indicate identified as Todt, are you referring to Anthony Todt?
Yes, I am.
May I have just a moment?
Of course.
I have no further questions.
Thank you. Mr. Mayor Sanchez, cross-examination.
Good afternoon.
Hello.
You never responded to the scene, correct?
No, I did not.
And you don't know where the prints or how the prints got to evidence?
I only know from the point when I was involved in the case, which is going into evidence to recover the latent prints from there.
And you don't know how the prints got to each evidence, correct?
I'm sorry, how do you mean to each evidence?
For example, you don't know how the prints got to the Benadryl box on 55-1.
I can only say that for the ones that I identified, the individual touched those items at some point prior to them being processed and lifted, but the manner in which they arrived there, I couldn't say.
And you're not certain on how long, or it's a long, extensive period of time for that print to be on there, correct? So, for example, it could have been days, it could have been weeks, it could have been months that print has been on there?
That's correct. I wouldn't have been able to tell how long a print had been left behind on an item.
And you didn't collect the prints, is that correct?
That is correct.
You were talking about there's indication sometimes when there's small prints that you're not able to compare, you kind of just throw out, is that correct?
Yes, if the prints are very small and there's not a lot of information, then we might not be able to utilize that information to do a comparison.
So because you weren't the one who collected the prints, you're uncertain whether or not there was those little small ridges on the, let's just say, the Benadryl box?
I did not collect the prints, so I can only analyze what was provided to me, and I can't say what possibly would have been left on the scene.
And you didn't go back to the scene to see if there was any relevant prints to collect?
I did not respond to the scene at all.
And you received known prints, known print cards from Anthony Todt, correct?
That is correct.
You didn't receive any known print cards from Megan Todt?
That is correct.
So you weren't able to compare Megan's Todt with all of these exhibits?
I did not compare Megan Todt to any of the exhibits.
And What is the standard, or how did you determine that Anthony Todt fingerprint is on the Benadryl box? I know you explained it, but how many ridges did you get to determine it's Anthony's?
So each individual print is compared individually. Each print is going to be different in the amount of information that's present in it. There's not a set number in latent prints for, you need this many ridge details to conduct a comparison or make an identification. And the reason being for that is because we actually use, as you guys heard me talk about in the beginning, a lot more information than just individual points to conduct a comparison. So in this case,
I'll just stop you right there. So in other words, this is a subjective test. This is based on your opinion.
to some degree, it is based on my opinion, yes.
Did you have someone check your work?
Yes.
Who checked your work?
The verifier in this case was Kara Bauckham. She's another fully trained examiner.
Did she sign anything?
Yes, she did.
Did you provide that to the state?
The final report was provided to the state.
And it has this, what's the last name?
Her name is Kara Bauckham, Baucom.
Majority of the prints that you looked at were from Benadryl boxes, correct?
That is correct.
Not from bottles?
If I may refer to my report.
If it will refresh your recollection, you may.
1, 2, 3.
Please look up at me when your memory has been refreshed.
It appears that 8 of the exhibits came from boxes.
Do you personally know what Benadryl is used for?
My understanding of what Benadryl is commonly used for is as a sleep aid.
Outside the scope.
You're not aware of who consumed these Benadryls, correct?
That is correct.
A moment, Your Honor.
No further questions.
Your rec?
No, Your Honor.
Witness step down.
Yes, Your Honor.
Is Ms. West excused from subpoena?
Yes, Your Honor.
Thank you.
May I approach and retrieve the evidence?
Yes. Ladies and gentlemen, at this time, we're going to take our evening recess. As always, please do not discuss any of the facts of the case with anyone. Please do not conduct any independent research. Please make every effort to avoid any media reports of this trial. If you happen to inadvertently come across any media reports or information about this case from outside of this courtroom, please discontinue watching or reading that information and so indicate when we return. The trial is going to continue tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. The process will be exactly as it was this morning. Our deputies will keep an eye out for you to arrive at the elevators at 9 a.m. I have a small unrelated docket. I do not anticipate that it will impede this trial, and I do anticipate we will get started promptly at 9. Get some rest. We'll see you tomorrow at 9 a.m. Thank you.
All rise for the jury.
Courtroom may be seated. We're going to take our evening recess at this point. Anything else we need to talk about? Defense? State?
No, Your Honor.
Trial will resume tomorrow at 9 a.m. Thank you.